Hey everyone, welcome back to Policy Punchline. Here at the show, we interview scholars, policymakers, and business executives about some of the most urgent issues and frontier ideas in our world today. I'm Tiger Gao. My guest today is someone of great personal significance to me. He is my thesis advisor and one of the most important mentors in my student career. Atif Mian is the John H. Laporte Jr. class of 1967 professor of economics, public policy, and finance at Princeton University. And he's also the director of the Julis-Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance, which has graciously supported this podcast since day one. Professor Mian studies the connections between finance and the macroeconomy, and his book, House of Debt, which I have here, became an instant international bestseller when it was published in 2014 and kicked off a critical line of research related to debt forgiveness and risk-sharing mechanisms, which we will talk about later in this interview. He is the first person of Pakistani origin to rank among the top 25 young economists of the world by the IMF. So Professor Mian, thank you so much for being here today with me. After all those years of doing this podcast, I finally have you on my show. So this is all coming together. It's great.
Thanks, Tiger. It's great to be finally on your show. I'm so proud of everything you've done, and especially this policy punchline initiative that you started and now will be followed through by other generation of Princeton students. So really terrific to be finally on your show.
Thanks very much. I think we have so much to talk about today, because I feel like over the past 2-3 years when I was at Princeton, I've constantly been at the intersection of finance, policy, macroeconomy, which is the sweet spot where your line of research sits. So every day I feel like I'm intersecting with some part of your research in some way. So maybe to start us off, just to give our listeners some overview, very broad overview, who is Atif Mian? How did you get to the United States? And how did you start a career in economics? And what do you research? So very broad questions.
Well, I'm from Pakistan. I grew up in Pakistan, did my schooling there, and I was just extremely fortunate that when I was finishing my high school, I applied to a few colleges in the US, and only one college accepted me, but that was the right college. So I came to MIT as an undergraduate wanting to do engineering. I was a math science student, and so I started doing computer science, went into mathematics, really loved mathematics. But one thing that always interested me early on were kind of big social questions, especially coming from Pakistan. The one obvious thing was very poor country, nothing seems to kind of work properly. And then you look at a country like the US, much richer, much better systems and so on. And a natural question that comes in the mind of a kid like myself is, why are these two countries so different? So I was always interested in those social questions. However, I was kind of a math nerd, kind of a student. So, I had no idea how to translate those questions into anything formal. Or I actually did not even know that, the field of economics exists in that particular sense. So it just tells you how illiterate I was at some level. But when I started taking classes, that's when I got exposed to economics. And what I really liked about that was that it combined the two interests of mine. As I've mentioned, I was kind of a science math student, but the questions were all exactly the kind of questions that I was personally very interested in, questions of social science at the end of the day. Why are some countries poor and others not, and why some societies seem to sort of function better than others. So that really excited me. By the time I figured that out, it was kind of towards the end of my undergrad sort of life at MIT. So I did graduate with math and computer science, but I had taken a few economics courses, and I thought, why not apply for PhD in economics, because I had the math background. And so that's what happened. So then I started my graduate life, and initially I was interested in development economics, again, given being from Pakistan and so on. But over time, I really became fascinated with, as you mentioned in the beginning, the intersection of macro and finance. And let me just say, very, very briefly, why I find that very, very interesting. Macro, at the end of the day, is about understanding how we are all connected in an economy, which I like to think of it as an ecosystem, right? So, like, your supply is my demand and vice versa, right? We are all connected in this web of financial and economic transactions. And we often don't think like that. I mean, you don't need to think like that if you, for example, have a 9-to-5 job and so on. But what's really happening behind the firm paying you, and and the consequences of your purchasing decisions and whether you buy a house or not and things like that, it really has implications for everyone else. That's what I mean by we are all connected. And understanding that ecosystem is just fascinating, right? And so once I kind of got a flavor of that, it really it really in a way brought to surface for me the power of studying economics, because those connections can sometimes, or often I would say, lead you to surprising conclusions or insights that you wouldn't otherwise have if you just, for example, read the newspaper and things like that. So you really need to understand the collective consequences of our individual actions and transactions, and that's what macroeconomics does. So that's number one. Number two, the other thing that really excited me was that in order to understand that ecosystem, which is really the system or the economy that we live in, it's really important to understand distributions. And so it really matters who has how much in terms of what the overall shape of this ecosystem looks like. And that's the other insight that I really like that comes out of economics quite naturally, which is that this ecosystem that I'm talking about, the health of this ecosystem requires a certain level of balance, which, by the way, is a very general concept. So for example, if you were to study planets, you'll also recognize they need certain balance of forces to remain in the orbits that they are in. Similarly, to maintain life properly on Earth, we know, for example, the regulatory mechanism of homeostasis, of how temperature is regulated, for example. That sense of balance is extremely important in all systems to survive and evolve in a healthy manner. And exactly the same is true about economic systems as well. And so that sense of balance is very important. And that's why distributions are very important. So I got very interested in that idea as well. You really have two challenges: that you want to grow, develop, and at the same time, you want to do it in a way that you maintain that balance. And what I've realized over time is that when that does not happen, when the balance is not maintained or achieved properly, you see the implications of that in, among other things, financial markets. So there is actually a close connection with a sense of imbalance and what happens in financial markets. And debt, for example, is one very important consequence of those imbalances. And so if someone does not have as much as they want, for example, they're going to try to compensate for that by borrowing, and that is going to lead to more debt in the economy. Similarly, if someone has more than they can really spend, they will try to lend it out to others. So again, you'll have more debt in the economy, more credit in the economy. You might say that's fine, and sometimes it is fine. But what I'm trying to say is that there are these natural connections between the macroeconomy and the financial market or the finance side. And those linkages, they really, as I studied more, it's like, I can't think of anything else that, it's because there's just so much to do, so much to think about. And so that, it's a little bit of a longer answer to your question, but that's really my journey in a few words of how I ended up thinking about the macroeconomy and financial markets.
You talked about that there's tremendous value in economics because it is studying from the point of view from the collective, not from the individual. And even in class, you kept telling us, the superpower of economists, which is, the economy is going to suffer if you don't come in. But if you come in, you can just push a few buttons and a lot of times fix the problem and dramatically improve the well-beings by rebalancing the imbalanced economy, taxation, or through some other regulations and so on. So which we should get into in a bit. But since we were talking about this intersection of macro and finance, and I guess this line of research, macro financial research, has become more important over the years, especially since the 2008 financial crisis. How would you define macro finance research? Is it different from traditional macro models? Is it different from financial economics? How should we think about this field?
In my mind, the field of macro finance is the two-way interaction between the macroeconomy, and when I say the macroeconomy, we sometimes also refer to it as the real economy. So this is where people get jobs. So, determination of how much employment there is in the society, how much people consume, for example, how much firms invest. Those are the kind of stuff. That's the kind of stuff I mean by when I say the macroeconomy. That's the real side of the economy. What happens in the real side of the economy, how that impacts the financial side. So what is the financial side? The financial side would be thinking about what is market, what is the valuation of stock market, what is the interest rate in the economy, how much credit there is in the economy, what does the household balance sheet or corporate balance sheet looks like, how much does a government decide to borrow, right? Those are all financial decisions. They are not about the real economy. They are not about, they are about some kind of paper, basically, right? How much you lend to. It's about securities and prices, and that's the financial side of the economy. But there's obviously a very close connection between those two. What happens on the real side, which is the macroeconomy, has implication for the financial side, and vice versa. And it's those study of those connections, which goes both ways. That is how I would define the field of macro finance, which, by the way, is a relatively new field. So we have traditionally had the study of the macroeconomy, the study of the real economy, which is called like macroeconomics. And then we have had the study of the financial markets, which is called finance, right? And typically, for various reasons, there has been somewhat of a sort of a wall between these two fields. So you either just study finance, like how much a stock should be priced and so on, without thinking that just taking as given the real economy. And similarly, people think of the macroeconomy taking as given whatever the financial markets look like, and not thinking too seriously at some level of possible interactions between those two. That really started to change, and really 2008 crisis forced people to say, look, you can't just ignore one aspect of these sort of this two sides of the coin, and that's really started this macro finance literature. And the book House of Debt we wrote was part of that effort, collective effort that we are all involved in. And I just kept working in that. And I think now it very clearly there is this field that we collectively refer to as macro finance.
Since when did you start getting into, I guess, this specific subfield called macro finance? When did you gradually start to narrow in? You mentioned you did your PhD at MIT. How were things going afterwards? Was it smooth sailing because you were obviously very good, or how did you figure out what you loved?
Yeah, no, it wasn't smooth sailing at all. Life is often never smooth sailing, by the way, even if it looks like from the outside. I graduated, I finished my PhD in 2001. And as I said, I was interested in development, and Abhijit Banerjee, who recently won the Nobel Prize as well, he was my advisor at MIT. So I was just planning on doing traditional development, but for various kind of just stroke of luck or whatever, I started looking into questions of finance and so on. What really intrigued me was, as I was looking more into finance and banking, was what was happening in 2006. And Amir Sufi, who also, we were both at Chicago at the time, University of Chicago, and you had this big mortgage. This was kind of the height of the mortgage boom, and we were just curious about why people are borrowing as much as they are, and what are they doing with this money? Because it looked superficially that people who are borrowing are like, they not necessarily have stable jobs and things like that. So we have this traditional notion of what we call the permanent income hypothesis, that if you have a stable job, expect much higher income, you may want to borrow, which makes sense. But when we looked at kind of even anecdotally, the kind of people who were borrowing did not look like those traditional borrowers in our textbook. So we were like, okay, we need to figure out what actually is going on to understand this linkage between what is happening at that time in the financial markets and the real economy in terms of people's consumption decisions and so on. And so we just started calling various data providers if we could get data on who are these individuals who are borrowing, so we could study this empirically. We were primarily empiricists, both Amir and myself. And so that's how it got started. We Equifax, which is a company that is a credit bureau, records people's credit information. We approached them, and to our surprise and really luck, they said, yeah, we are willing to share the data with you, our administrative data. And that's really how it got started. So this was actually before the financial crisis. This is 2006 we got started. And you can see the crisis at some level was a lucky break for us at some level, that we were already kind of working on this, and all of a sudden we saw the implications of all that borrowing, markets collapsing, and interestingly, both financial market and the real economy, right? So you can see both financial and the real side, or the macroeconomic side, both of those collapsing at the same time. Obviously, a strong sense of connections between the two. And so we just kind of gave up on everything else, and we're like, this is the thing to dive into. And so that's how we kind of really started this research agenda.
You mentioned that you were both empiricists, you and Professor Sufi. So would you say a lot of the macro people are a little bit more on the theoretical side, especially when we talk about macro models? It's like 80 equations all on paper, and it seems very, very complicated. And you guys really started using a lot of the micro methodologies, applied micro methodologies to study macro issues, and that was really the fascinating intersection.
Yeah, it turned out that that also became like a new trend, or perhaps even wave, which has been extremely beneficial, I think, for economics in general and macroeconomics in particular. Because macroeconomics is the study of the aggregate overall economy, a natural constraint that you face as a macroeconomist is that you kind of only observe one observation. Like, take any US economy. It's just, at the end of the day, you take GDP, that's just, and you just test one number, and you're seeing the evolution of that one number over time. The natural limitation of that is that how much data you can throw at macroeconomic questions traditionally has been rather limited, because you just have this one observation every year, every quarter. How much can you really discern from that? And you really didn't have much more information than that. What really changed, but perhaps people did not recognize the usefulness of that early on, was the IT revolution. So the IT revolution, really the 90s and so on, it started recording financial and economic transactions in a way that just wasn't done before. So, we never had the capacity to record millions, tens of millions of observations on, who is borrowing how much every month, are they paying it back, at what price are they borrowing, and things of that nature. All of that data was slowly getting collected, from 90s onwards, and then 2000 onwards. But people did not fully realize the usefulness of that data for answering, again, those meta big macroeconomic questions. And what we realized, Amir, Sufi, and myself, when we started thinking about all this financial crisis and all those questions, was that this actually can be extremely useful for studying the big macro questions of why is unemployment all of a sudden rising beyond 10% and so on. Because the way to think about this is that when we talk about macroeconomic hypotheses or different theories for why you are observing something, there often are competing hypotheses for very legitimate reasons. One party might argue this is because of contraction in demand. Another party might argue, well, this is really because taxes are too high, or whatever the different theories might be. Those different macroeconomic theories often have different cross-sectional implications of what will happen under one hypothesis to a given set of individuals versus another hypothesis to the same set of individuals. And so if you have more granular, this individual or micro level data, that allows you to potentially construct experiments of sorts that allow you to discriminate between whether it's theory A or theory B that's leading to the big macroeconomic trend that you're observing, like a financial crisis. And so those are the kind of points we tried to make early on in our work. Is like, okay, let's take these 2 or 3 competing hypotheses. They have different implications about the cross-section that you can then test using more granular micro level data. And in a way, when you do that, you're naturally starting to marry the micro level applied empirical techniques with the macro models and their implications. And that turned out to be extremely useful. It allowed you a different set of tools that the field of macro did not have before that. Again, for just technological reasons, the data was just not there. But because of the IT revolution, now we have that kind of data. And so it really opens up it sort of widens the canvas on which macroeconomists can paint and draw, and then that's really a big addition to the toolkit for macroeconomists.
So maybe this would be a good segue to talk about House of Debt, which is really your critically acclaimed book that really put you on the map. Larry Summers, Paul Krugman, like everybody back then. I've talked about this book, wrote about this book. The research really inspired some other further additional research. How did you come exactly to the certain conclusions that you came to in this book? What were some of the findings, and how did you come up with this idea of shared responsibility mortgages, SRM, which would be crucial and very helpful going down in the road? So
yeah. So, the life of a typical researcher is that you typically kind of, move from one question to the next, right? And then sort of it's one research paper at a time kind of a thing. But the papers tend to be related, because when you ask one question, it leads to further questions. And so that's how you write the next paper and so on and so forth. But what we realized as we were doing this work was that there is a common theme. An overarching message that there's this common message that's coming out of this work that we are doing, which was to understand the depth and the severity of the 2008 crisis, and also to understand why the recovery from it is as slow as it was. So when we did all of that, individual pieces of work, sometimes focusing on the crisis, sometimes focusing on the recovery, sometimes focusing on one aspect versus the other, what we realized was that there is actually a common theme. And so it almost organically, we felt the need that we need to write a book. We never thought we would ever write a book. We were just writing academic papers, and that's the academic life. But we really realized that there is a need to put all of this together in the form of a book. And so even some publishers started contacting us. So we said, okay, it's not just us, other people are thinking along the same lines. So then that's when we started exploring this idea. What is that common theme? I think that common theme is very much connected to what I mentioned in the very beginning of what excites me about macrofinance as well, which is it became kind of apparent to us that the real problem in the financial crisis is that, as I said, we are all connected through the financial and the economic system, but the way we have designed the financial system in particular is designed in a way that it has some fatal flaws, so to speak, that does not take those connections into account. And in particular, the common theme that we thought is really important to emphasize in this context is the theme of risk sharing, or the importance of risk sharing. And then, so let me just illustrate that very quickly. If you and I are two different households in an economy, and let's say, you are very well off, I am not as well off. So, but both of us, we want to own a house. You can just buy the house outright. I can only put a small down payment, and then I borrow the rest from you. So in a way, you are partly owning my house. So I borrow and I buy a house, it's an expensive house for me, given my income and all of that. Now, if for whatever reason there is a big crisis, like a big dip in house prices, what will happen is, because you own your house outright, you are seeing house price go down, but if there is, you don't feel the pinch as much as I do, because I borrowed, most of the money to buy the house. So if I have a 20% equity in that house and the value of the house goes down by 10%, I have basically lost half of my net wealth, because I've lost 10% of the 20% equity that I had in the house. You, on the other hand, you still have exactly the same amount that you lend to me, because your lending to me is protected, because the value of the house remains above the total amount that you lend to me. So a natural consequence of this system of financial transactions that we have means that in the event of a downside shock, like a dip in house prices, myself, who's the borrower in this example, will disproportionately feel the downside shock. Now, if you say, okay, that's fine, somebody bears more of it and so on. The problem with that implication is that not only am I feeling a disproportionate sort of impact of the initial shock, it is also the case that because I am sort of less well off, typically I am also less able to bear this shock. For example, I'm probably more likely to get laid off than you, precisely because I'm not as well off. I don't have as stable an income as you, and so on. Or you might have savings that you can tap into. I'm not that wealthy, that's why I'm borrowing from you, and so on. So the shock ends up hitting me harder, and B, I am less able to withstand those kind of shocks. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to all of a sudden stop spending as much as I would. I'll try to kind of really just go back into a cocoon, so to speak, just do my groceries, but don't, I'm not going to take those extra trips. I'm not going to buy that, a new car that I might have been thinking about, and so on. And when there are many people like me, that's going to lead to a certain contraction in the economy, because aggregate demand is going to fall. You, on the other hand, are just doing what you were doing before. You're not going to start spending even more, right? So you're not going to compensate for the shortfall in demand that is coming because of my reaction that I just described. And so that thinking, that's the picture that was becoming very apparent in the empirical work that we were doing. And what that shows is the importance of risk sharing, that the original sin, if you will, was that when we designed the financial system, we should have put in this financial system some notion of insurance. That is to say, if there is a bad shock, I am insured through some mechanism against that kind of, because it's not my fault, right? It's not my fault that the whole world economy is tanking. It's not like I did anything bad personally. And so from a theoretical perspective, that's also the right notion of insurance. You want the most susceptible to be insured against events that they have no control over. Just like a poor farmer needs to be protected against bad weather risk, because you don't want them to suffer for no reason or no fault of their own, I should say. And so that's the, so there's this notion of we are all connected, we're all in this together, distribution matters, insurance mechanisms really matter, and that really then dips into the political economy, the legal, how you structure the mechanism. There are so many aspects of it, unemployment insurance, whether you have fiscal consolidation inside the US versus not, for example, in the European Union. Those kind of things become really first order once you start thinking about this notion of the importance of insurance. And so we thought we need to talk about this. We need to write about this. And so, we did all of that in the book. And then just as an example of what you can do to sort these kind of problems, we said, what, the sort of the traditional mortgage that we have can be improved upon by adding this insurance mechanism in it, which is what we call the shared responsibility mortgages. And that's how sort of those ideas developed. But again, I think the more important thing was that we felt there was this common theme that develops out of this collective experience of ours out of the 2008 recession that we thought was important to explain to others.
I guess the COVID-19 shock is often kind of compared with the 2008 financial crisis because it was also a big exogenous shock to the system. How did you feel about the government's response in the US towards the COVID response? Obviously, we saw the Federal Reserve came in with a lot of support, but also on the fiscal side, there was the unemployment insurance. There was also some kind of a universal basic income in the form of stimulus checks. Did you feel like these were the right of buffers or cushions that really alleviated a lot of the pain? Or
yeah, no, absolutely. It's really, because we were kind of in the middle of the 2008 crisis as well, and obviously we all experienced COVID, at some level, it's night and day difference between the response to 2008 and the response to COVID. I hope partly because of the lessons learned from 2008 crisis. I remember when we were talking about 2008 and so on, even some people on the left a bit criticized us in different levels. So, for example, you mentioned Larry Summers, who was kind enough to say positive things about the work and the book. But even Summers said that we were perhaps a bit naive on the policy side, because we were basically saying, look, the government is not doing enough, especially for the households. They need to be protected against foreclosures, and so their mortgages need to be restructured automatically instead of putting these homes in foreclosures and so on. Even people on the left said, look, this is a bit naive, this would be too extreme, we can't do that, what about the banking system, and so on and so forth. And we kept saying, look, you have to take the system as a whole. There are real implications of these individuals being forced into foreclosure. They're going to cut consumption, they're going to their house prices are going to fall even further. That's going to have a negative kind of feedback snowball effect and so on. So you need to nip it in the bud. You need to cut it off by providing, again, that insurance, right? It's just that idea of collective insurance that's super important. Unfortunately, not as much was done as was needed in the time. And that's, again, another thing we tried to say in the book House of Debt. Luckily, the response to the COVID crisis in terms of what I would say orders of magnitude larger, in some respects at least. And that has really helped limit the overall macroeconomic impact. So unemployment insurance was very generous, extended for longer periods of time. The fiscal stimulus was much more generous in the COVID response relative to the TARP bill and so on in post-2008. And then the third thing that happened in the COVID crisis, you already mentioned the checks that were also helpful. But then another aspect, just to give you an example of what did not happen in 2008, but did happen in the COVID crisis, was the eviction moratorium. And so you could not, so we never had a foreclosure crisis. We never, and that was a huge help on the housing market. And the mortgage market and the financial system and the real economy. So they all, this feedback that I talked about in the beginning is very important to keep in mind. In 2008, we had this very narrow view that the only thing we need to save is the banking sector. That's basically and that, you can let households suffer. You can let household balance sheets go down. You can let 4 million people go into foreclosure. As long as you protect the banks who are lending to these individuals. This was fundamentally the flawed logic of that particular time period, and that's what we sort of reacted to partly. And I think from that perspective, again, the COVID response has been much better, and we now have the evidence. So that's very heartening to see as well, that we have the evidence. There's some very nice work that people are doing right now that actually does exactly that comparison of 2008 versus COVID. For example, on this mortgage market, housing market, and individual spending aspect. And it really bears that out, that the big difference this time is that again, you can think of this as insurance, if you will, that this sort of taking hold of the situation through the government and providing this insurance against, really, this isn't, it's nobody's fault, right? Very obviously, this unforeseen collective punishment of sorts, we need to insure each other. We are all in. I keep saying this word over and over again. We are all in this together. That's the thing that comes out of the study of the ecosystem. Again, that is our economy, that we need to insure ourselves against these collective mishaps.
Because the key issue is that when households are not doing so well, then aggregate demand is falling because people are not spending as much. The economy is also running into other constraints like zero lower bound. So you cannot just stimulate the economy with monetary policy. So this is really the time you need to help the household so that they could in turn help the economy recover faster. And that's what hopefully we have done in COVID. But I guess, as you said, the 2008 experience was that we really thought we needed to save the banking sector, which in hindsight, it probably, the US did recover faster after saving the banking sector. Probably better to do that than, letting the banking sector fail. But what we're saying is they should have also stepped in to help the households like we did this time with COVID, at least doing things like the moratorium on foreclosures, extending certain deadlines on which you can pay back your auto loans or your home mortgages. That is something very reasonable to be done in COVID. That's kind of the broader logic here, if I'm understanding correctly.
That's exactly right. And just to add one other thing to it, it becomes, even if you on the saving the banking system aspect, it becomes much easier to save the banking system if through, for example, fiscal actions, you support household balance sheets in those times. So they raise aggregate demand, that raises aggregate GDP, and that is going to raise the net worth of banks as well, because obviously they are lending to the entire economy. And so again, this is again why macrofinance is such an interesting field to study, because what you realize is that one needs to have a holistic view of the economy when you are thinking about designing interventions in the midst of any crisis, COVID or housing, and understanding those connections and then intervening with all margins in focus actually becomes a self-reinforcing mechanism that lifts all boats, so to speak, together, as opposed to just focusing on one. You get lesser bang than for the same buck if you just focus more narrowly.
So I guess one question on everybody's mind is, did we overdo it in the COVID crisis? Obviously, I know economists have often said when the house is burning down, you don't call up the fire department and say whose fault is it. You save the house first. So it was good that the Federal Reserve stepped in very aggressively. The federal government stepped in very aggressively. But people in the financial markets are certainly concerned about inflation, which we can talk whether that should be concerning, but also deficit, other issues brought up mostly by people on the slightly more conservative side. They seem to be criticizing that there is a shift in the consensus within mainstream economists towards becoming much more Keynesian, ultra Keynesian consensus rushing into the Biden administration. Maybe not modern monetary theory yet, but really MMT light version of stimulus. What do you think of those criticisms? I know you're not a big fan of modern monetary theory.
Yeah, I was going to say let's put MMT aside. I wouldn't I wouldn't want to unnecessarily mix the two things. First of all, you want to err slightly in the direction of overdoing things when you're in the middle of the crisis, both on the fiscal and the monetary dimension. The reason for that is that if it ends up being the case that you have overdone it, you have mechanism to unwind it. So for example, on the monetary policy side, you can raise rates sooner or a bit higher. So I understand there are limits, but on the margin, you want to do it, you want to deliberately overdo things a bit, because the other risk is really, it's asymmetric.
Underdoing it.
Downside. Because then you lose control of the economy, if it starts to drop, if it starts to dip for various reasons. So on the other end, if the recovery starts becoming too strong at a certain level, you have ways of controlling that by, as I said, by raising the interest rate on the monetary side, or on the fiscal side. For example, you also potentially have mechanisms of, for example, changing your expected spending or raising taxes if you need to do that. So those, it's easier to cut spending if it turns out that you are spending more than you should, or it's easier to raise. I guess that's debatable how easy it is to raise, but at least conceptually you can do things on the fiscal side if it turns out that you overdid it the first time. But really, the evidence so far suggests that it's good. Whatever was done was good for the economy, and there is no strong case so far that I can see that suggests that yes, inflation is higher, but really prices are kind of recovering back to where they would have been in the absence of COVID, and a little bit of inflation is perhaps warranted anyways. But again, you have to weigh all of that against the alternative of how many more millions would have suffered and so on. So I think it's important we keep that perspective in mind.
I think one thing I learned from this year doing research with you, obviously because of I was studying the efficacy of debt forgiveness program and policy evaluation, but this idea of counterfactual, meaning what would have happened if you had not done this. So a lot of times, if you hadn't done this, the situation is much worse. It's not just normal, it's like much worse. That could be the case. So yes, but maybe Professor Mian, we should talk a little bit about just giving our listeners a sense of what had happened over the past 30, 40 years, those long run, what you call secular trends, because you talk to us a lot about how both from a statistical and an intuitive standpoint, a lot of the shocks within business cycles, within market cycles, they might have high variance in the short run. They might catch a lot of attention in the media, but in the long run, it kind of cancels things out. But there are also those little long run forces that have very small variances in the short run, but eventually in the long run, they really add up and they show up. If you look at some chart over 40 years, you're like, oh, I didn't realize this is the elephant in the room. And so there's something deeper happening than that doesn't appear into the day to day. So maybe we can talk about some of those, what people call macro financial trends. And perhaps I'll show some charts from your lecture, and maybe we can go over some of these. I thought that would be nice. So I'm pulling up for our listeners. You can watch this on YouTube. We'll have this on the screen, but you can also listen on Spotify, iTunes. You will get the same information. But Professor Mian, maybe we can just quickly go over some of those charts that you have: rising debt, falling interest rate, global liquidity trap, credit spread, and so on. I'll let you take it from here. So.
Sure. I think we've all heard this story about this frog who is sitting leisurely on a pan full of water, and he doesn't realize that there's actually the stove is on underneath it, and it's actually slowly warming up, and until it's too late, and then it's too late to jump. Right. The one way to think of that story is that the frog doesn't jump because he doesn't recognize these slow moving but very persistent force, right? That's the point. Slow moving but very persistent forces like the water gradually heating up. You may not, by the way, climate change, global warming is another example of that. You may not kind of notice it on a day-to-day, month-to-month, or even a year-to-year basis. But if that force continues to build up underneath, you want to make sure that you recognize them before it is too late. And what you're showing on the slide is very much connected to that. So far we have talked about like the crises, right? Whether it's COVID, pandemic, or the 2008 crisis. But it turns out that there is a bigger force in the background that is perhaps even more important than either the pandemic or the 2008 crisis. And that is the rise of inequality. It's now very well documented that across the globe, since the 1980s, the global economy, especially the advanced countries, including the United States, they have been experiencing a continuously rising inequality. And in particular, it's extreme inequality. So what I mean by that is that the best way to think of that, and like you have it on the slide up here, is the share of income that goes to the top 1% globally. That share of income has been rising. It was like around 10% in 1980, as you can see the blue line in this graph. But it almost doubled to close to 20% in more recent years. And it happened gradually over time, right? This is like this water becoming hotter and hotter for that frog. What we have been working on in recent work is thinking through the implications of this rising inequality. And this again connects the macroeconomy with the financial markets and vice versa. And it also connects it also plays out the importance of distribution for the overall macroeconomy. So let me try to describe what I mean by that. You can look at this, the share of income going to the top 1%. Okay, it's almost doubled since 1980, but so what? Who cares, right? It turns out that it really matters. Not only from a distributional perspective, you might say as a society, we don't want there to be very large differences between the rich and the non-rich and so on. And I think those arguments have a lot of appeal. But let's put that aside. Okay, I'm not making a subjective judgment.
Yes, an ethical normative judgment about rich isn't good. Yeah.
Exactly. Let's put that aside. As legitimate as those arguments might be, let's put that aside. And I'm going to make a very kind of a practical argument, which is that such rise in inequality is actually not good for all of us collectively. And we need to recognize the dangers of extreme inequality for the system overall. Again, this idea of the economy being the ecosystem and this importance of this ecosystem maintaining a sense of balance is extremely important. And the problem with extreme rise in extreme inequality is that it threatens that sense of balance in a way that it threatens to bring down the entire economy with it. Okay, so now it's no longer a moral argument that extreme inequality is dangerous. It's no longer a moral argument. I'm actually making a practical argument from an economic standpoint that extreme inequality is not healthy for the overall economy. So let me now try to explain why that is the case. The key thing to start things off to understand is that in terms of human behavior, there is one important difference between the very rich who keep getting more versus the rest of the population. And that key difference in their behavior is that the very rich, think of Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, whoever in that league, if you keep giving them $1 million more, $1 billion more, they have already satiated themselves in terms of how much they can spend on themselves and their family in terms of their consumption. So in technical terms, their marginal propensity to consume out of the extra billion that you give them is not very high. So what does that mean? That means they try to save the additional income that they keep on getting more and more of over time. So the key question is and that's exactly what I meant by the way, that we are all connected, right? Their savings has to go somewhere. So what does all of that mean? That means if you keep raising extreme inequality, again, what I mean by that is income going to the top 1%, because those individuals are going to largely be saving the additional income that they are getting, overall, from a macroeconomic perspective, you now have an additional accumulation of aggregate gross savings that need to go somewhere. The key question is what happens to those savings? And what has happened since 1980s, and you can see that in the graph that you're showing on the slide right now, is that those additional savings have been channeled back into the economy in the form of ever rising debt. And so the picture on the left that you are seeing right now is a picture of total debt or credit in the economy as a share of the overall size of the economy. So everything is normalized by GDP. And what you can see is that since 1980s, and by the way, if you had drawn this figure from, let's say, 1950 onward, you'll see that this rise really starts in 1980. Like it's flat before that, and it really starts to rise after 1980. So what you can see very clearly in the data is that as the economy is becoming more and more unequal, again, in the form of the top 1% earning more and more, there is this tremendous rise in credit or debt in the economy. And the key point we are trying to make in this new work, a lot of it is joined with Ludwig Straub at Harvard, is that these two things are intimately connected. This rise in inequality is intimately connected with this phenomena of rising reliance on debt or credit. This credit or debt, by the way, takes different forms. Sometimes it shows up as people borrowing more through mortgages, but other times it shows up as governments having to borrow more. And again, the reason they have to borrow more should be very intuitive at this point. The reason governments and non-rich households have to borrow more is somebody needs to spend for the economy to maintain balance, for all the people to remain employed. Someone needs to spend. So if Bill Gates and Bezos of the world are earning more and more, but they are not spending it, but they are wanting to save it, it must be the case that someone else takes their savings and spends it. And that can only happen in the modern economic and financial system. That can only happen through credit or debt, which is that they borrow from them and then they spend that money either in the form of government running deficits, persistent deficits, or in the form of non-rich households borrowing and then spending that money for their individual or household consumption. And that's exactly, as I said, what has been happening more and more of from 1980 onwards. Now, at this point, you can say, okay, fine, interesting story, but so what? It's a system that's functioning fine. As they get richer, other people can borrow more, and so what's the problem? The problem is that when you are spending through borrowing, it helps you today, but tomorrow you have a problem because you have to pay the money back. Now, this is where the story gets a little bit more interesting. For the sake of argument, Tiger, let's say you are Jeff Bezos, right?
Yes.
So if I borrow from you and I spend that money today, tomorrow I have to pay that money back to you. Now, there are two problems with that. The first one is tomorrow when I try to pay you the money back, I actually have to pay you not just the money I borrowed plus interest back to you. That's one problem. The second problem is when I do that, I have to actually cut from my spending to pay you that money back. Because remember, last period I had a high spending because I was borrowing from you. Now, if I have to pay it back, I have to cut back my spending. You, on the other hand, when you get that money back, the problem is you are already very rich. You are not going to spend that money. So we are back to square one. So what happens next year now? Well, next year, the only way the economy can maintain its balance is if you give me my money back. You say, basically, that's called refinancing.
Yeah, continue to lend to you.
My original loan, but even that is not enough because you are now continuing to earn more and more. So I must actually keep my higher
consumption
by borrowing even more. Now we have a problem. How can I borrow more when my income is not rising? Remember, you are the one becoming richer and richer. I am not becoming richer and richer. Your share of the income is rising faster. The only way, and now we are going to understand the second graph on the right that you're showing on the slides. The only way we can sustain this mechanism of ever rising borrowing to sustain the same level of spending in the face of ever rising extreme inequality. The only way we can sustain this game, so to speak, is if the interest rate continues to fall. And that's exactly what we have seen. So that's the second picture on the right, which is labeled falling rates. As we have seen, there are different ways you can calculate interest rates. So that's why there are different colored lines. But the basic point is all the same, which is as we have seen inequality rise, we have seen debt rise for reasons I just described. But none of that is sustainable. This is the point about balance. This is the beauty of studying the economic system. None of that is sustainable or feasible in the long run unless the interest rate, which is also the price of debt, if you like, continues to fall. Because that is how you are going to allow me to continue to borrow more because the debt service payment is lower and lower and lower. And that's exactly what we have seen over time. that interest rates, and now you're showing me this global picture, which is extremely interesting and fascinating, right? So global interest rates were typically on an upward trend until 1980. Again, notice this strange coincidence. Exactly when inequality starts to rise, we see this massive downward trend in interest rates, which again is very well documented the world over. And it's really a global phenomena, right? Although I'm using US because it's the most important economy and so on, but it's illustrative of what's happening globally, what's happening everywhere. So the only way, where are we now? The only way to sustain this economy of ever rising extreme inequality, the only way to sustain this economy, the only way to keep this economy in balance is for the level of debt as a share of GDP to continue to rise. But that is only possible if the interest rate continues to fall. And that's exactly what's been happening. Except there is a problem now, which is there is a limit to how far you can push this mechanism.
Ponzi scheme in some way, this game.
Yeah. And we are kind of close to approaching that limit, because one way to understand that limit is, remember, you're trying to put more credit in the system by lowering interest rates, but at some point interest rates get close to zero, which is kind of where we are right now. And it becomes much harder. It's like, this term people use, pushing on a string. That's what you're trying to do more and more, because interest rates will just not be, it'll become impossible at some level to push interest rates even lower. And then you have a real problem, because now you cannot raise debt because interest rates cannot go lower. And so you cannot spend as much as you should. And so the economy overall has this demand problem, if you will, which will then start to, all else equal, it will start to impact on growth, and growth will start to go down. An economy will start to contract relative to what it would have been, right, in the absence of such negative forces. And this is really the punchline of, again, we are all in this together. Rise in inequality actually hurts everyone collectively. It's no longer a subjective matter. It's no longer just an ethical or moral question.
So Professor Mian, I think another parallel trend that was happening was that there's also fallen investment and productivity. So real investment has actually fallen, productivity has fallen. So in some way, this credit boom that we're seeing right now is not really being invested into building new roads or something. A lot of times we're seeing this huge growth in credit. It's demand driven, it's not supply driven. So the ongoing question that a lot of people are asking is, what are the forces driving up this finance but not real investment? This is the greater financialization of the economy, of the credit boom, but not the real economy boom per se. So I guess that's also a parallel trend that's been happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And this other parallel trend is, I would say, the other big question that needs to be addressed. It's all actually, they're all related to each other. So in particular, the rise in extreme inequality partly reflects the rise in concentration or accumulation of economic power, right? The two naturally go hand in hand. If all of a sudden one firm like Amazon dominates the retail sector, then obviously who owns that firm is going to be earning more and more. So this rise in extreme inequality has been connected and correlated with this other fact, which is the rise in industrial concentration of a few firms having a larger and larger footprint in the market. Now, why is this related to the investment point that you were making? One, there's a large literature on what promotes investment, and very intuitively, as you can imagine, more competitive landscape is a good mechanism for promoting investment. If you and I are fighting for market share, we will, I will try to outsmart you by innovating, exactly, investing in R&D, trying to innovate, trying to, provide better services to the customers, so they come to me rather than go to you. Competition is good. The problem is if for various reasons, again, partly related to the same sort of trends that are leading to rising inequality, if concentration is also rising, you will see less reason for investment, number one. And again, that's very much consistent with what we are showing earlier. The other interesting fact is, and this is also, by the way, connected to some recent work we did with Ernest Liu, who's at Princeton. The other thing is there's actually a feedback. Remember the story I told earlier where the interest rate is falling because of rising inequality. It turns out that there's actually this important feedback mechanism between that fall in interest rates all the way down to zero and this rising concentration or rising market power in the system, in the economy. This, by the way, is another example of macrofinance, how what happens on one side, in this case interest rate, which is the financial side, has a feedback effect on the real side, which is how concentrated the structure of the market is. And the reason for that is that very low interest rates are actually more beneficial for people who already are ahead. That's actually a fascinating question for various reasons. Again, we will talk about some of those in that work I just mentioned. But the bottom line is, because lower interest rates, especially very low interest rates, are more beneficial for industry leaders, it tends to perpetuate concentration and hence inequality. Now think of how this is a sad realization, right? Because interest rate is going down in a way to rebalance the economy, to respond to the consequences of inequality. But what it's partly doing in the process is it's actually perpetuating, institutionalizing at some level that inequality even more. So you really get stuck. I think that insight is very important to understand that when you study the system as a whole, not only is this rising inequality an issue for all the reasons that I mentioned, but the response, the natural economic responses of the system to rising inequality happen in a way that it actually cements that problem even further. And so it really boils down to the importance of taking action through policy to respond to these. I think that's a very important realization, and that's why this is, in my opinion, the most important question on the economic side. There are many other questions as well, but I think on the economic side, the rise in inequality, the lack of balance that I explained, is the most important economic question. From a macroeconomic perspective, again, I'm not making any value judgment here, as important as those judgments are, but from a macroeconomic, and this is what I feel is not well understood yet. Yes, a lot of people, I would say even on the political left, when people talk about inequality, the usual argument, which I agree with, is again the moral argument. But I think it is very important to understand that in addition to that moral argument, there is a second imperative. And I think if we focus on that second imperative as well, it will actually enlarge the umbrella of how many people actually should care about this problem. That just like we should all care about climate change, we should all care about the rise in inequality because it is impacting the entire economic structure at this point in a way that it is making it unwholesome. Let me just make one last sort of comment in that context. I think is very important. And again, I want to use this example to highlight yet another reason very low interest rates feedback in perpetuating inequality. The idea is the following. So again, we have all understood why rising inequality leads to rising credit and hence falling interest rates. Once you understand that, it has one more implication, which is extremely important. And that implication is when interest rates fall, a natural implication of falling interest rates is that asset valuations rise. Again, the reasoning is very straightforward. Anyone who's taken kind of finance 101 is familiar with what we call the present discounted valuation, right? If you're trying to value a stock, or if you're trying to value, a property which is giving a rental income to you, the way you determine its value today is you discount the future cash flows to figure out how much you're willing to pay. And the discount rate is a function of the prevailing interest rates. If you can borrow very cheaply at very low interest rates for extended periods of time, which is pretty much the case these days, you will value the same asset a lot higher than you otherwise would have. So what does that mean? That means as interest rate falls, for all the reasons that I mentioned, a natural correlate of that would be that asset valuations will continue to rise, which, by the way, is exactly, again, what we have seen, right? So it's not just, I'm not just hypothesizing. You look at the data and it's, again, time and time again, the data confirms what we might fear. Now, why am I emphasizing that? Because this rise in valuations actually ends up also perpetuating inequality. And the reason for that is who owns the existing assets? By definition, it's going to be the rich. And the more unequal the distribution is, the more unequal are going to be the gains in those asset revaluations as a result of falling interest rates. And so what ends up happening is that the non-rich who don't have much of those assets, they feel more and more left out. And housing, by the way, is an excellent example of that. What we have seen over the last few decades as these phenomena have unraveled across the world, including the US, it is becoming harder and harder for first generation homeowners to actually be able to buy a house. It's really fascinating to look at in the data. Home ownership rates are falling in the US. And more importantly, home ownership rates for first-time homeowners, which is to say, people who are not rich enough to actually own a home through their parents, for example, that home ownership rate is now the lowest it has ever been in modern US history. And the reason for that is not that they can't get credit, it's very cheaply available. It's this unwinnable game they're in that while more credit is more cheaply available, the house prices have risen even faster. And their incomes have not kept pace, which again goes back to the problem of entrenched inequality. And so you're really stuck in this bad equilibrium where extreme inequality is becoming more and more entrenched. And most importantly, as I tried to explain, it is having these perverse macroeconomic consequences that end up threatening the entire ecosystem, the entire macroeconomy.
Professor Mian, you talked about the financial markets, the housing market, which we should get into in a bit, but just to quickly reiterate your point about the imbalance between the rich and poor, I think that is why a lot of economists, including you, support more progressive taxation, wealth tax, because it's not even it's less about a revenue argument. People often say you can get the same revenue through this current system. It's about correcting that imbalance, adjust a little bit more of a distributive mechanism, and that is actually more key to the problem to solve the imbalance and not just the revenue problem. But I guess to quickly piggyback off of that, when you talk about how to address this imbalance, how to push the U.S. out of secular stagnation, or in other kind of charts that we saw, you know, the falling interest rate, falling investment productivity. How do we stimulate the economy out of this? There are people who say the way is to spend out of this. Well, we don't have to get into modern monetary theories, certainly, but even what Biden administration is doing right now seems to be, not worrying about that deficit for now, and for good reasons. How do you think about that front, and how would you address people's concern about quote unquote Fed printing money? Because you explained to us in class, it's not really printing money. It's a very, fantastical way of portraying this in the media. But what exactly is happening when, quote unquote, the Fed monetizes the debt and prints the money? And is that the right way to stimulate this economy out of this stagnation?
Yeah. You asked many questions, Tiger, and they're all important, big questions. I'll try to take them on sort of one at a time. The first point to keep in mind is that the kind of problems that I talked about, because they are driven by these, as I mentioned at the very beginning, these slow-moving, persistent forces of rising inequality. And really, this rise in inequality, it's driven by, again, more, part of it is technology, but other part is, maybe the lack of antitrust regulation and things of that nature. So it's really, it's deep in the, and other part is just, lobbying and the political economy of this, people earning rents and all of that is in it. But my point is that these slow-moving forces that we are all now bearing the consequences of, they are deep structural forces in the economy. I think that's very important to recognize upfront. Why? Because when we start talking about potential policy solutions, which is what your question is really about, those policy solutions have to be of the same nature. That is to say, the policy response has to be also structural in nature. You have to attack the problem at its foundation. Otherwise, it's just putting a band-aid on a deep wound. Otherwise, it's just, as the cliche goes, you're kicking the can down the road. And unfortunately, that's what has been done over the last many, many years. And one worry is that we will continue to try to do that, but we are kind of at a point where you can't do too much of that without bearing more and more negative consequences. So what does that mean? Let me try to give you an example. First of all, you really need to work on ways to change the structure of the economy to reduce the extent of extreme inequality. And if you are unable to do that, you're not going to solve this problem. So fiscal spending, so for example, if you just blindly say, we have a problem, let's do deficit spending and be done with it. It's so easy to do, right? Borrow, interest rates are low, borrow, and let's just do it and be done with it. This is where it's a bit, you really need to understand the system. Otherwise, the statement is right. Yes, we need to do deficit spending given the short-term problem of weak demand. So yeah, do it. But if you do it without addressing the structural problems, you are going to stay in this problem forever, in a way. And sometimes I say that's no way to live, right? Because think of the consequences of, like, for example, we just talked about home ownership and how first generation is finding it hardest ever. This is the land of opportunity we talk about. It's no longer true. Because if you can't buy a house in the right neighborhood, as very nice research has shown, being able to buy the house in the right neighborhood is extremely important for good outcomes for my children.
Yes, social mobility, healthcare, everything. Yeah,
exactly. And so again, the broader point I want to make here is, while deficit spending is needed in the short run, if that's the only thing you do, and you don't address the structural reasons for rising inequality, you're going to be unsuccessful in the long run. And our society will continue to sort of atrophy in that sense, that this mobility of young but not well-off generations to rise to the top, having the same chance, is going to be less and less true in this system, and that's very important. So that's why deficit spending is not necessarily a solution. As you all already have mentioned, we need to rebalance the system, and that's going to require a combination of things, in my view. So let me give you an example. One is progressive taxation, but really, because the problem is driven by extreme inequality, you need very progressive taxation. And that means thinking seriously about wealth taxes, for example. So I personally, I strongly support the kind of wealth taxes that were proposed by Elizabeth Warren. I think they are needed, they are warranted, but my justification for that is actually perhaps different from even what Senator Warren says. And again, I don't disagree with those statements. What I'm saying is that there's actually another, perhaps even bigger reason to go for that kind of taxation, because we need to rebalance the economy for all the reasons I've tried to highlight. And I would actually even be in favor of putting those kind of taxes in place and then reducing taxes for the middle class, maybe the indirect taxation through payroll and so on. So that's, I would similarly raising the minimum wage. It's things like wealth tax and raising the minimum wage would be one example of what I would call structural reforms. So first of all, I think we need to think more boldly in terms of the reforms that are needed when we take this problem holistically. But just the taxation is not going to be enough. I think the other place where we need to think more seriously about is public investment. People have talked about the lack of public investment, the lack of infrastructure investment, the lack of investment in R&D, for example. I think those things are very important. We really need to, for example, boost R&D spending in especially what is unfortunately sometimes called the flyover country, right? Out away from the coast. We really need to build centers of innovation through public spending, build research universities and the ecosystems around it through public investment in middle America, and really change the inequality across geography in the US. I think that's not a healthy thing either. So that's another place where I think we need to focus more on. And then finally, the third pillar, if you will, of changing the structure is through antitrust regulation, by dealing with the rise in market concentration. I think that's the other, breaking up monopolies. That sort of, I think that there's a need to think more seriously about that, especially in this new economy of, where digital platforms have this sort of natural monopoly kind of flavor to them. You really need to think more seriously about what is the right way to regulate them to minimize sort of the perverse monopoly effects of these platforms. So that's the third place where we need to focus on. But that in my mind is the way to respond to this deeper structural problem. In my mind, it really starts with communicating why we need to do this. And this, for me, at least, that's the area where I can do something. And so for me, that is the excitement of doing macrofinance literature in this area right now. As I said, I think of inequality as sort of the big question that we need to seriously think about and think about its consequences, and then how to respond to those consequences.
I know I looped in too many questions. Every time I ask a question, it's like 5 questions. But regarding the point about what we're seeing today, the imbalance in financial markets, especially after the COVID shock, the Federal Reserve obviously stepped in very aggressively. There was a lot of deficit spending on the federal government side as well. How should we view the relationship between this fiscal monetary coordination? Is the Federal Reserve printing money? How should we think about this?
Well, first of all, as we discussed, because the interest rates are already at zero, at least the interest rate that the Fed directly controls, which is the short end of the yield curve. So there's no more monetary policy to do if that's all you were in this game for. And so, first of all, the only other thing the Fed can do is buy bonds by issuing reserves, right? Now, which is what they have been doing and so on, and you can have different opinions on that. But one point I want to just highlight is that when the Fed does that, you cannot call it printing money if that's the only thing that happens. Why? Because all they are doing is they are going inside the balance sheet of the private banking system. They are buying bonds from those private banks, and they are replacing them with reserves. And when interest rates are close to zero, they start looking more and more like these two things. You're just replacing bonds with reserves on banks' balance sheets. If that's the only thing that happens, it's not much has changed actually. Even though the numbers are they've bought trillions of this and that, practically not that much has changed. And I think that's the first thing to keep in mind, and which is why, despite the Fed borrowing in seen magnitudes, the real economy doesn't seem to kind of react much to it. And there's some work showing that it's there are some effects, but they're not huge effects and so on. So the reason is exactly what I just described, right? Because if you actually just go through the mechanics of it, it's not. So what is actually happening is whoever owns, so think of yourself as owning shares in JP Morgan and so on. Whoever owns these private banks used to own treasuries because the banks were holding those treasuries. But now instead of holding those treasuries, they have reserves, which are kind of as good as treasuries, and are as I was saying, at zero interest rate, they're kind of priced similarly as well. So not that much actually changes. The only thing that can be different is what the fiscal side is doing, right? So is the government actually issuing more bonds and spending against it? So the only kind of game in town at some level is really the fiscal side, which is true, and that's. But even there, it's like somebody when the Fed issues bonds, somebody has to hold those bonds in. And otherwise the interest rate will rise and so on. And what we have seen is that despite the Fed issuing more and more bonds, people are lapping it up. Even today, as we speak, the 10-year rate is sort of almost at all-time lows. If you exclude some of the deep dives in the middle of COVID, it's kind of as low. There's no reason to worry about rates being high in any historical sense, not at all. And yet debt is at its highest level in recent history. What explains this? And in my view, what explains this is, once again, is the fact that because of these extreme levels of inequality, there is this more and more willingness at the very top of the wealth distribution to just hold paper, right? But there are consequences of that propensity to save so much at the very top, which is that the aggregate demand, the economy suffers for all the reasons that I mentioned. And so again, the only game left in town is for the government to say, you know what, you want a piece of paper, I'll issue you a piece of paper. But they are the only player in this economy that can issue them a piece of paper that they really want to hold and then spend against it, right? Because no one else can do that. That's the key thing. That's why fiscal policy remains the only game in town in this circumstance, and that's where we are in. So what do I think about all of that? As I said in the very beginning, you need to do that. There is no other option available. It's the only game in town. However, you cannot continue to do that. That's no way to live, as I said earlier. We need to start addressing the structural causes of these problems. Otherwise, a world with extremely high levels of debt and zero interest rate, you can also think of that as quote unquote financialization of the economy, if you will. A world like that, an extremely unequal, concentrated world with very high credit and debt, zero interest rates. Yes, you can live like that for a while, but as you do that, the society is actually suffering on dimensions that we should all care about, which is it's not a land of equal opportunity for all. It becomes more and more a world of very large differences between the haves and the have-nots. And ultimately, that's not sustainable, especially in a democracy. In fact, even in a non-democracy, I don't think it's sustainable. And we are facing the consequences of those problems already, very much apparent. And so again, that's why I think while we have the opportunity, speaking about people in power, I think while they have the opportunity, they need to equally recognize the urgency of the situation. I would give the same analogy of less like climate change. It's urgent, it needs to be addressed, and I would put extreme inequality in the same sentence and say, just like we talk about climate change, a very real threat, it needs to be addressed. You cannot kick the can anymore. I think similarly on this side, there is a need of urgency on the political side to go for structural reforms. Something we have not seen happen, and I've already talked about what I mean by that.
Professor Mian, are you optimistic at all? Because there doesn't seem to be any political momentum that is, we saw some momentum on raising the global minimum tax rate for corporations to 15%, and that G7 countries agreed on that, and there's some progress there. But domestically in the US, Biden was talking about bringing the corporate tax back. Even had he lifted corporate tax rates, it would have been in historical, in the long run of history, still very low. But it seems that wealth tax, higher corporate tax is nowhere to be seen in the US. People are more fascinated by talking about culture wars and Wuhan lab and many other issues rather than addressing those structural issues. And so I don't know. Are you pessimistic about what would happen if in 10 years, 20 years, still no progress?
I mean, that's a hard question in a sense that, first of all, I have no comparative advantage, and I'm certainly not in the business of predictions or forecasts, right? I think of myself as an economist as, that my job is to give you conditional statements. Like, if this continues to happen, then this is where you are heading. If you change your direction, then you'll be heading in a different direction, and so on. And so I feel a lot more comfortable making those kinds of statements. And so that's why I keep saying, look, what we are doing right now is not good in terms of our long run trajectory for all the reasons that I mentioned. And at the same time, I feel confident saying that this is the direction in which we need to go. These are the kind of structural reforms we need to do. So I feel much more comfortable making those kinds of statements. Now, your question is fundamentally about me putting probabilities on the likelihood of those structural reforms happening. Now, that's a much more difficult question, and so on. I'll say a couple of things on that. The first one is, if I look at history, and I'm not a historian, so other people can judge better, but when I look at history, history is often very non-linear. And that gives me pause, first of all, in terms of trying to predict things too far. And at some level, that it makes me optimistic as well as pessimistic. It's just that, it's hard to predict. Things can change very suddenly. What I do feel is, one, on the positive side, on the more optimistic side, when the structural problems have these negative consequences, they naturally build pressure points. People may not fully understand why, but they do understand things are not working. And they do understand things need to change. They may not know exactly how they need to change, but they do understand things need to change. And that's what I mean by the positive side, that there is, and you can see this both on the left and the right. They might disagree on what needs to be done. But I think there's this growing pressure points. Now, it's both optimistic and it's both pessimistic, right? Because what you don't know is what these pressure points result in. Do they result in kind of this, free for all, what you were calling cultural wars and even worse kind of wars? Or do they result in a change in status quo on the policy side? And we get towards some deeper structural reforms like we did have at some point, like the New Deal and things like that. So I personally find it very hard to give you my sort of probabilities on what those events are. I think both are possible, unfortunately. I can see both happening. I don't know exactly which one will happen. What I do say is, okay, let's try to be positive. And let's try to talk about what we feel should happen. And to the extent you can make a contribution in changing those probabilities, I mean, those probabilities, by the way, are not given by, it's we who determine those probabilities, right? And so to the extent we can talk about these issues in a reasonable, civilized manner and all of that, and to the extent we can sort of, convince others of what we need to do, just like climate change, you would want to do that and so on. That's my sort of positive take on that. It's like, okay, it's like, whatever situation you're in, as I tell my children as well, just think about what is the best thing you can do. Don't lament on your situation too much and things of that nature. So let's try to talk about what we should be doing. And hopefully, if enough of us think like that, change is possible.
Professor Mian, you mentioned that you're not here to forecast. And there are some other charts that I'll try to show on the screen right now. In class, you showed us some charts about the Queen asking a room full of economists, why did nobody notice the 2008 financial crisis coming? And you showed us how economists from central banks, Wall Street, all kinds of institutions systematically are unable to predict this long-term decline in long interest rate. They keep overestimating how high interest rates will go. They keep overestimating how high inflation will go. And there are some secular trends. So I guess we won't go into the certain details, the technicalities, but just seeing these charts and thinking about very broadly about economists' ability to forecast, like are economists good at forecasting? Like, are humans good at forecasting, especially under uncertainty?
Yeah. No, we are not. As the chart you're
The short answer is no. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, even, I mean, you can say this is unfair. You'll always have difficulty in forecasting something, even if you're good on average. But certainly the economy, it's very hard to forecast. To the extent people publish these forecasts, there's a long literature, and part of it suggests that ability of professionals to forecast is not much better than what you could do, just a robot kind of trying to forecast through some simple, vector autoregressions and things like that. So no, we are not that good at forecasting necessarily. However, for the picture that you are showing, what that picture suggests is that these forecasts have been missing some common persistent force that has been hitting the economy since the 1980 onwards, because that's when the forecasts really turned out to be, significantly worse for the future. And my candidate for what that force is again the rising inequality and the implications of that. Given, again, the key thing is, given the primitive fact that the very rich who are getting richer, they don't tend to spend at the same rate out of that increased income as everyone else. That would lead you to miss the forecast if you did not take that particular force into account. And so that's my interpretation of that. Again, I want to be cautious and say, I like to think of myself as a man of science, and I would say, look, I cannot prove it, because that's a very difficult thing to do, but that would be my guess of why we have been missing this forecast, is because people have underappreciated the impact of inequality on long-run interest rate.
I know we don't have too much time left, so maybe I'll ask you a couple quick questions about on the financial market side of things. We've been talking about this word financialization, and maybe I'll just ask you to explain that a little bit, because what we saw, you tweeted this when the GameStop saga was, the meme stock saga was happening a couple months ago. You were saying, this is really some kind of what's it called? The symptom of a greater disease, a reflection of a greater symptom, however you call this. That is the greater financialization of the economy.
There are different ways to think about financialization. Obviously, it's not a scientific term, right? So first of all, people mean different things by this term financialization. But one way, let's go back to, we have already had that conversation, right? We were talking about all of these reasons, these deeper structural reasons that are forcing interest rates to go lower and lower. Number one. And I also explained why interest rates, especially long-term interest rates going all the way to zero or close to that, raises asset valuations, right? Now, in fact, mathematically, if interest rates, you don't have to go to zero, but mathematically, if they get close enough to zero, valuations actually become undefined. And so we just can't even talk about it. They become undefined in the sense that you can even say infinity is a price, right? It makes no sense, but it's it's like, in that sense, becomes undefined. And that's the problem. We didn't have time to talk about it, but now you've given me an excuse to talk about it. This is yet another reason why very low interest rates are kind of, as I keep saying, this is no way to live. This is another reason this is no way to live, because it leads to valuations that are kind of not really disciplined by anything material or real. And so in that world, there's a lot more you can start to justify, right? Bitcoin or whatever, Dogecoin or whatever, however it's pronounced.
Dogecoin, yeah.
These all kinds of crazy stuff starts to happen. And yeah. GameStop is another, a small minor example of that. But the basic point, the broader point is that at very low interest rates, you can sell anything. That's another way of saying that, right? Because when values are more and more undefined, you can start selling anything, and you can say, look, okay, I promise you some small probability of making $1,000, but guess what? The value of that could be a lot, could be anything. And so you start going into a world where if you can make a lot of money if you can kind of defraud people for a short time period, because valuations are very high. That's one way of thinking about it. So all kinds of perverse incentives start to come out in that kind of a world. And you start to see that, you start to see people pitch businesses which are not doing anything real, but they are just kind of, securitizing a bunch of stuff and selling it under a different name and so on. You start seeing a bunch of, that's again another example of financialization. You start a lot, I don't know if you see that, maybe it has something to do with the kind of YouTube searches I do, but so often I see YouTube ads about, again, Bitcoins or some cryptocurrency and so on. And like, what is all of this adding to human welfare? Like, what are they doing at the back end? Nothing really. So these are all examples in my mind that they can happen in any point in time, but I think they are a lot more likely and they appear a lot more attractive in a world with very low interest rates. So this is yet another reason. I didn't focus on that, but this is, I think, also an important reason to say, look, we need structural change. If you keep on doing deficit financing to roll over this problem, yes, you can do that for a while, but then interest rates will remain very low, actually, right? And that's not a good overall environment to be in. Again, I keep using that phrase. This is no way to live. That's there's all these concepts. They relate to the same point.
What do you think about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin? And well, I think we probably have to separate the speculative aspect, the investment aspect of it from the technology, because there are a lot of people who say the idea of decentralized finance. I don't know if you heard of this DeFi, this, powered by blockchain, Ethereum or, computer scientists building applications on this, peer-to-peer transactions, no longer requiring central counterparties. It seems to be a very promising idea. I had lunch with Tyler Cowen and Alex Tabarrok, who are two very prominent economists at George Mason University, and they're very bullish on this, digital currency in general, but also DeFi, and they think this is the future where, this is a whole space being built out in front of people, and they think a lot of people still refuse to acknowledge the technological breakthrough, the linearity of how this space could blow up. So what do you think about this space?
Yeah. Look, the first answer to this is if you think this is extremely useful, first you have to show a product that is actually useful, right? So let's stop talking in complete abstractions. I understand anything can be very useful, right? I mean, I can talk about string theory as potentially being very useful. Like people but at some point you have to show something, right?
Yeah.
Like, what is it? Like, solve a problem that was otherwise very difficult to solve with this problem. So I'm not disagreeing with the fact that it could, in principle, be useful. Yeah, sure. Why not? But I think, the entrepreneurs need to come up with a product where that is. I haven't seen that yet, but maybe I don't disagree with the possibility that might happen. That's one. Let me just say one thing on that. I am very bullish or optimistic about one aspect of this, which is the possibility of what is called CBDC, or central bank digital currency. I think that has a lot of potential. It's a very interesting thing, and again, that will be a longer discussion and so on. But just to give you an example of something that is broadly thought to be in the same space, I think that can be extremely useful. For example, it allows us to go back to this notion of narrow banking, which is something that people talked about, very important economists talked about in the aftermath of the Great Depression, in what they refer to as the Chicago Plan and things of that nature. So I think we now, after almost 100 years, we now have the technology to actually be able to do something about those ideas. That I find very fascinating, right? So just to give you one example of where I think, but it's not the standard crypto thing. Moreover, understanding monetary regimes is very important before you jump into the possibility of private currencies. I mean, at some broader level, I think the notion of privatizing currency is a terrible idea. I mean, just forget about which technology you do it through. The idea of privatizing currency actually is not a good idea. Actually, let me loop it back to the very beginning of this. That's what I mean by you need to understand monetary economics to be able to kind of follow through the logic of this. But the reason privatizing currency is a terrible idea is that one very important consequence of having a public fiat currency of the kind we have in modern times is that you can use currency to insure risks across the population. Through easing monetary policy, through monetizing fiscal actions in times of extreme distress and so on. This was a tremendous insight that came out of a number of very influential people working in this area. And so having monetary independence, having monetary authority, and then using it in combination with fiscal authority at times, if nothing else, seigniorage, the revenue potential of seigniorage. Obviously, you need to do it properly with discipline. We understand the limits, right? But it's a very useful public tool to have. And in the extreme, I think the idea that it's okay if you give it up through some notion of decentralized private currencies is just nonsense. I think those individuals don't know anything of what they're talking about. There is a reason, just to give you one last example on that, there is a reason no economist of any repute would speak in favor of the gold standard.
The hard money, commodity money. Yeah,
exactly. You can think of that as kind of Bitcoin on steroids, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So again, I think we need to be very careful when we put these ideas out there. Just to say one last thing on Bitcoin is just so silly. It's just so easy to put it down. I mean, it's using tremendous amounts of energy. Yeah. And the only real use of it is for criminals to, demand ransom. And if we are, wasting so much energy for that one use, really, that's the real practice. Speaking of practical usages, right? That's the one I've seen. What else can Bitcoin really be used for? So it's really, it's very sad actually that, from Elon Musk to Cathy Woods and others, it's really sad that people in the public domain have spoken positively about something that is so silly and potentially destructive. It says something about the financial sector overall, I think. I mean, I think there needs to be some level of seriousness about, where we are heading and what is the point of some of this stuff that is thrown out there. I just think that, for all those reasons, I think it's important that we think about, again, all of these questions from the perspective of the overall common public welfare. It's very important to keep that focus in mind. Otherwise, you can just get swayed by, sort of silly arguments at times. You have to say, okay, what are you trying to accomplish here? What problem are you trying to solve? You must be able to at least identify some real problem that some new technology is able to address. Otherwise, it's just, another Ponzi scheme or something even worse.
Professor Mian, this is all very fascinating. And I think just to gradually tie the conversation back to the beginning, and also combining this discussion about financial markets, do you think finance practitioners and market participants sometimes may have a more nuanced and realistic understanding of finance than academics and policymakers, or vice versa? So, because a lot of people might say, oh, a lot of the stuff coming out of finance academia, efficient market hypothesis, Black-Scholes equations, they don't actually work when practitioners use them, and vice versa. So how, because you very much sit at this center, Julis-Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance, which is policymakers and academics and investors. So how do you bridge those perspectives together?
Yeah. First of all, I react very negatively to any attempt to stereotype people, right? So if anyone says, look, the academics are all a bunch of just rubbish, or anyone look, these people in the financial markets, they're all rubbish. It's for whatever reason. Obviously, that's wrong.
Yeah.
I think all of us have our own comparative advantages, and everyone can bring important insights to the table, and everyone has their own core set of comparative advantages. I think people in the financial markets, they're very good at understanding the institutional limits of certain conceptual arguments. So take efficient market hypothesis as an example. The very simplest form of efficient market hypothesis will take the idea of price discovery as given. The market's just the wisdom of the crowds figures out what the right price of something should be. But a market participant understands you cannot take that as given. That the whole idea of price discovery, you need to know the market microstructure of who can trade with whom and what are the costs of not figuring out what the right price is. Can you bear that cost or not? This whole thing that you can just kind of, with the swing of a pen, you can assume it away, basically, right? By just assuming rational expectations, for example. So I think that's where connecting with the real institution players, just giving you an example of that is very important. And I love talking to real players exactly for that reason. It's like I want them to, I think the most important insights they convey you is every theory in any scientific discipline for that matter is based on certain premises, certain assumptions. That's just the nature of everything we do. You have to build stuff on certain normative assumptions and so on. The real world people are very good at telling you how, so you want those assumptions and premises to be realistic, right? That's very important. Otherwise, you're just talking about some fantasy world that doesn't exist. So it's very important to talk to people in the real world. For example, if you're modeling the financial markets, it's very important to understand to what extent your assumptions are realistic. On the other side, I think places where academia is super helpful, and I think market participants often miss that, is exactly what I was starting off with, is what fascinates me about economics, is that we, in the academic discipline, we have developed a set of tools that allow us to analyze the system as a whole. So all of this conversation about general equilibrium feedback effects, for example. So if you go back to the conversation we had about how inequality can lead to rise in debt and falling interest rates and everything else connected to it. As far as I know, I mean, you have to be an economist really to be able to say all of this coherently and then sort of, put data around it and so on and so forth, right? It's hard to imagine an individual financial participant investing all the time and effort to study that, partly because you're not going to get any immediate financial gains out of doing that. But these are still very important social questions. So I think there are natural ways in which we can complement each other from the market to academia and vice versa. And then obviously policy sits somewhere in between, right? Because they need to do so. So that's the way I like to think of it. It's a team sport. We all have our roles to play, and I think we should all try to play our roles constructively.
By the way, how do you view your relationship with Pakistan at the moment? Do you still interact with them a lot? Because I know that's your home country, and you were previously appointed to the Pakistani Economic Advisory Council, but then unfortunately that didn't go through because of religious reasons. You're the only economist I feel like when I go on Twitter, like after every tweet there's like a bunch of hate comments. It's like the only economist that has that. But yeah, we can talk a little bit more about that part. So.
Well, I as you said, it's a very unique position to be in. It's unfortunate. As you said, I am from Pakistan, and I deeply care about the country and the people who live there. I wish I could do something that could be of use to the country on the policy side and so on. But for the reasons you mentioned, it's not possible for me to do that at all.
Because of your certain religious minority.
Religious reasons. So my sort of religious affiliation is discriminated against in various ways. There's been a long history of propaganda of sorts, and as you can imagine, so you get a very strong, at times, negative social reaction from a certain, not everyone, obviously, but from a certain segment of the population, which sometimes spills over on social media, and that's what you're referring to in terms of the reply tweets and so on. It's a unique position to be in, as you said, relatively in academics. It's not a fun position to be in for sure, but you try to learn from everything in life and move on.
What exactly is the face?
Yeah, sorry.
What exactly is your face? The part that is being discriminated against? If you don't mind telling us a little bit about it.
It's called the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, but it's that's but it's persecuted at various levels, including through the legal system, and so that makes it very difficult for me, even though I'm just an economist. I don't whatever
highlight religious. Yeah.
I feel personal beliefs should be kind of separate from any economic conversation or other conversation for that matter. But unfortunately, that's not the reality on the ground. And so as a result of that, I cannot engage in the policy conversations there.
What are some of the questions on your mind these days? Just your current research agenda, some of the plans going forward. Do you have a 5-year plan, 10-year plan? What are some of the goals you set for yourself?
As I said, I really feel that this issue of inequality is front and center, and its policy consequences. So everything that we talked about over the last couple of hours, I'm very, very passionate about that. I think those have very important policy implications. So I do like to write about it. I do like to talk about it in every chance I get, including this current session. And so there's a lot more to do in terms of research that I'm currently involved in. I'm very excited about that. I think it'll take at least the next few years to sort of finish that work. And as is always the case, life is full of interesting questions. I'm sure something else will come up. But I do feel the question of balance in the economy is a fundamental question that we need to think about. I think we have a serious collective problem at hand that needs to be addressed collectively, which is the problem of extreme inequality on one hand, and the challenge of inclusive growth and prosperity. I mean, I think it's very important to live in a society, and I think we now are at a unique point in history where that is possible, where every child who is born wherever, of whatever background, nationality, religion, or whatever it might be, that every child has a relatively similar set of opportunities to thrive, to grow, to enjoy life, and that's a wonderful thing to have. I think I feel we absolutely have. If you think of we absolutely have enough food to feed everyone. We absolutely have enough sort of capacity to provide healthcare to everyone, and so on. But we are not doing it, right? And that is our collective failure in terms of the structures we put in place, in terms of the systems of government, the financial systems that we run, and so on. So I feel that is that's a very important challenge. And this was one of the reasons, as I said in the very beginning, this was one of the reasons I wanted to become an economist, is to be able to, I said, it's the social questions that interested me. So I think these are very important questions, and I think we have, but I say we, I mean, economists, I think we do have some important things to say on that in terms of how we can make our collective state better, more appealing along all these margins. And so that's what excites me. I want to talk about it. I want to communicate that to the extent I can. But that's it. I'm just, as I often say, I'm just a nerdy academic at the end of the day. I don't have any power. I'm not interested in power. That's not my comparative advantage. But I hope to be able to communicate the ideas, and then those who do have power, those who do have political stakes, that it's hopefully they can come together and solve some of our deeper problems.
Is there ever a moment when you wish you were a policymaker, were a billionaire, were someone with power? So let me put it this way: in an alternative, in the case of unobserved counterfactual, who would Atif Mian be? What would you do?
No, I'm very fortunate in that respect. There has never been a moment in my life. I think I can say that honestly. There has never been a single moment in my life where I've wanted to be a politician, where I wanted to be someone powerful. Certainly, where I wanted to be a billionaire. I don't know what I will do with those billions. So I feel very fortunate, really, that I'm doing what I'm doing, and having the freedom to do. I think this is just for the younger people listening out there who are thinking of careers. I think this is what I love about being in academia. I mean, I absolutely love being in academia because it gives you the flexibility or freedom to kind of ask the questions that interest you. It's a very unique. I mean, if you think of it that way, everywhere else you go, someone puts a bunch of files on your table and says, do this. It's like, this is your job. I don't care what you think. Do what I'm telling you to do, right? That's the nature of what a job means. Or even if you're running a business, the nature of it is that you're trying to convince someone to buy your product or service, and so on and so forth. But here you pick the questions that you're interested in, and then you're not in any other market. The only market you're in is the market for ideas. And for me, that's fascinating. I mean, I think that's the way to say about it, that having the freedom to ask your own questions, and then engaging in no other market but the market for ideas. I mean, that's just a fascinating world to be able to live in. The opportunity to talk to young people like yourself. I keep getting older, unfortunately, so there's nothing I can do about that. But what I can do is I can, stay connected with the younger people who keep coming through the universities and so on. And that, to me, it's one of those things that you realize more and more as you grow older, is just the value of that. It's just the value to be able to talk to young people and so on, because they always have interesting thoughts, ideas, and so on. I don't think of it more as I'm teaching anything, but it's more really like learning from that experience. It's like, oh yeah, I never thought of it like that. This is an interesting question, things of that nature. But then also equally importantly, learning from young scholars. You might notice I try to work with a lot of young people as well. It's like it's because again they bring in a level of energy that is just tremendous. And so again, for all those reasons, I think I'm very fortunate to do what I'm doing, and I really. One honest answer is I don't think there's anything else I can actually do. I mean, I don't think I can hold a job if I had to. So perhaps more realistic reason that if I try to do anything else, I'll fail at it miserably.
Professor Mian, I just want to say I'm very grateful for your mentorship, and I keep learning from your own humility. You probably don't remember this, but so last fall, I still remember when I went into the Rhodes Scholarship finalist, and I didn't actually win the scholarship after the committee interview, and you wrote the words to me. I don't mean to disclose your email to the world, but you did say, thanks for letting me know, Tiger, and congrats to getting to the finals. All such things in life have a lot of noise, so don't take the outcome to mean anything, especially given you reached the end. The most important aspect of success is to keep your head down and keep pushing in a consistent way, working on the big questions. You'll get to the promised land. And I just remember reading those words, feeling incredibly encouraged. I have to say, I almost cried when I read those words. I mean, those were just so beautifully written. And I just want to say, it's just been an amazing experience being your advisee this past year, writing my senior thesis under you. I mean, every meeting we have, it's you're pushing me in a new direction, pushing me harder and harder to test my own limit, my own potential. So I just have to say, I keep learning from you, because you think about the world's best economists, you think about them as they don't have time to respond to emails, they don't have time to talk to you, they have no time for actually get in touch with you. But to learn from you is just an incredible privilege of mine during my Princeton years. So thank you so much. So
thanks, Tiger. This is very generous, but thank you.
So at the end of our show, since the name of our show is Policy Punchline, I've asked this question, like 150 times by this point, but if still hits home when I ask you this. What would the punchline be for you as you conclude this interview?
I think I've been saying the punchline throughout in different ways. We are all in this together. I think that's the punchline. We are all in this together, and we need to think of our collective common good. It's a lot of fun to actually build stuff that benefits everyone. And I think if all of us try to do that a little bit to the extent possible in our lives, we can all have much better futures.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Professor Mian. I hope you enjoyed the interview, and well, I certainly encourage our listeners to go buy your book, House of Debt. I know most people in the economics community have read about it, certainly, but in case some of our listeners haven't gotten this book, it's really a timeless topic that they could read into, and follow you on Twitter and keep learning about these topics. So thank you so much for joining me again, Professor Mian.
Thanks, Tiger. Thanks.
And this concludes this episode of Policy Punchline. Please follow us on iTunes, Spotify, read and review us. You can watch this full video on our YouTube channel, and you may see some of the slides that Professor Mian and I presented on the video. That was probably a better experience than just listening to the audio. You can follow Professor Mian at Atif Mian on Twitter. And thank you so much for listening today, and we'll see you next time. You've been listening to Policy Punchline, a podcast generously supported by the Julis-Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at Princeton University. We would also like to encourage you to follow other podcasts produced by Princeton University, such as Politics and Polls by the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Policy Punchline is intended to be informational only and does not reflect nor represent the views of Princeton University or the Julis-Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. For more information on subscription, donation, volunteering, or contact, please visit policypunchline.com. Thank you again for listening.